Picture this. It's mid-October 2025, and a gleaming luxury liner called the Riviera is slicing through Pacific waters, just 48 nautical miles from Shanghai's Huangpu River Terminal. On board, roughly 1,250 passengers are preparing for what they've been promised would be an exciting port call in China's most cosmopolitan city. Bags are being packed, shore excursion tickets are being reviewed. The anticipation is palpable. Then, without warning, everything changes. The ship's captain announces an abrupt course correction. Shanghai is off the itinerary. Instead, they'll be heading to Busan, South Korea. The disappointment among passengers quickly turns to confusion, then frustration. What could possibly justify such a dramatic last-minute change to a carefully planned cruise route? The answer lies in a single number: $1.6 million. That's the fee the Riviera would have been forced to pay had it proceeded with its original plan to dock in Shanghai on October 15th. This wasn't a random surcharge or an administrative error. It was the opening salvo in a new chapter of economic confrontation between the world's two largest economies, one that threatens to reshape global shipping, disrupt supply chains, and ultimately impact the price you pay for goods in stores. Welcome to the latest battlefield in the ongoing trade war between the United States and China. This is the story of how port fees became weapons, how ships became pawns, and how a decades-old trade investigation tool is now being wielded in ways its creators never imagined. To understand what happened to the Riviera, we need to rewind just slightly to October 14th, 2025. On that date, Chinese authorities activated a sweeping new maritime policy, one that had been brewing for months but still caught much of the shipping industry off guard. The regulation was elegant in its simplicity, but devastating in its impact. China announced it would begin collecting what it called a special port fee on certain categories of vessels. But this wasn't your typical docking charge or harbor maintenance fee. This was targeted economic retaliation, designed with surgical precision to hit American maritime interests, where it hurts most. So, who exactly would be paying this new fee? The criteria were comprehensive and left little room for ambiguity. Any vessel owned by a United States-based company would qualify. Ships operated by American firms, even if registered elsewhere, would be included. Vessels where U.S. entities controlled 25% or more of ownership, directly or through complex corporate structures, would not escape scrutiny. Ships flying the American flag were obvious targets. Even vessels constructed in American shipyards or built by U.S. shipbuilders would fall under this policy. And in a particularly personal touch, ships owned by companies whose board chairman held American citizenship would also be subject to the charge. The fee structure itself was designed to escalate over time, applying mounting pressure. Starting from that October date, the rate was set at $56 per metric ton of the vessel's gross tonnage. But this wasn't a static number. Chinese authorities announced a schedule of increases that would see the fee climb steadily until reaching $157 per ton by April of 2028. For massive container ships and cruise vessels that can measure tens of thousands of tons, these numbers multiply into staggering sums. The timing of this policy was no accident. China explicitly framed this measure as reciprocal action, a direct response to what the United States had been doing to Chinese shipping interests through something called the Section 301 investigation. If you're not familiar with Section 301, you're not alone. It's one of those bureaucratic policy tools that operates largely out of public view, but wields enormous economic power. Section 301 gets its name from its location in the U.S. Trade Act of 1974, specifically Section 301 of that legislation. When it was originally crafted 5 decades ago, the provision was meant to give American trade negotiators a tool to combat what they deemed unfair trading practices by other nations. The basic concept was straightforward. If a foreign country was found to be violating trade agreements, engaging in discriminatory practices, or otherwise treating American commerce unjustly, Section 301 authorized the U.S. government to respond with measures like tariffs, import restrictions, or export limitations. For years, Section 301 was used sparingly, reserved for specific trade disputes that couldn't be resolved through normal diplomatic channels. But in recent years, particularly during Donald Trump's first presidency and continuing into his second term, Section 301 transformed from a rarely used diplomatic tool into a blunt instrument of economic warfare. Trump's approach to trade policy marked a fundamental shift in how the United States engaged with the global economy. He openly referred to tariffs as weapons and seemed to relish the confrontational stance this implied. Rather than viewing international trade as a system of mutual benefit where nations specialize and exchange goods to everyone's advantage, Trump's worldview treated trade as a zero-sum competition where one nation's gain necessarily came at another's expense. China, as the world's manufacturing powerhouse and America's largest source of imports, naturally became the primary focus of this aggressive trade posture. The Section 301 investigation against China wasn't a narrow inquiry into a specific violation. It was broad, sweeping, and designed to justify extensive tariffs and restrictions across numerous sectors of the Chinese economy. But here's where the story gets particularly relevant to our tale of ships and ports. Among all the industries targeted by Section 301 scrutiny, few were hit harder than China's maritime sector, both its shipping industry and its shipbuilding capabilities. To appreciate why the United States chose to target China's maritime industries, you need to understand just how central shipping is to the Chinese economy. China isn't just a major player in global shipping. It is, in many respects, the axis around which modern maritime commerce rotates. Consider the infrastructure alone. Chinese ports have established regular shipping connections with more than 700 ports spanning over 200 countries and territories worldwide. This isn't just impressive on paper. It represents the physical arteries through which China's economy breathes. Every single day, approximately 80,000 container ships bearing Chinese ownership or operation are actively moving across the world's oceans. These vessels can reach essentially every significant trade region on the planet, from Southeast Asian neighbors to European markets to African coastal cities. The scale becomes even more striking when you look at the numbers. In 2024, cargo departing from Chinese ports accounted for 31% of all maritime freight globally. Think about that for a moment. Nearly 1/3 of everything that moves by sea has a connection to Chinese ports. This makes China not just dependent on shipping, but makes global commerce dependent on China's shipping efficiency. For a nation often called the world's factory, this maritime network isn't a luxury. It's absolutely essential. China's economic model relies on importing vast quantities of raw materials and energy resources, processing or manufacturing them into finished goods, and then exporting those products to consumers worldwide. Without efficient, reliable maritime transport, this entire system collapses. This dependency makes shipping a tempting target for economic pressure. If you want to impact China's economy without direct military confrontation, disrupting or increasing the cost of its maritime operations offers tremendous leverage. The United States government understood this calculation perfectly. The Section 301 investigation targeting China wasn't a sudden development in 2025. Its roots actually stretch back to August 2017, when President Trump first authorized this probe during his initial term in office. What began as an investigation soon, morphed into action. Starting in 2018, the United States began systematically imposing tariffs on Chinese goods. These weren't modest adjustments to existing trade arrangements, they were substantial additional charges applied to hundreds of billions of dollars worth of products. The total value of Chinese goods subjected to these tariffs eventually reached approximately $370 billion. That's not the amount of the tariffs themselves, but rather the value of goods affected. Given that roughly 95% of all trade between China and the United States travels by ship, these tariff measures had immediate ripple effects throughout the maritime industry. Chinese shipping companies found themselves navigating not just ocean routes, but increasingly complex regulatory obstacles at American ports. Reports began emerging of Chinese-flagged container vessels experiencing unusual delays at U.S. customs. Ships that should have been cleared for unloading relatively quickly instead found themselves subjected to enhanced secondary inspections. Their cargo sat in containers on deck while paperwork was scrutinized, questions were asked, and approvals were delayed. Each additional hour spent at dock meant increased costs, port fees, crew wages, and perhaps most significantly, the opportunity cost of not being able to pick up the next scheduled cargo. Beyond these direct delays, American authorities also erected what trade analysts call non-tariff barriers, obstacles that don't appear as official taxes, but nonetheless make commerce more difficult and expensive. Chinese shipping companies faced restrictions on the types of contracts they could bid for and limitations on the volume of business they could conduct at certain ports. The China COSCO Shipping Corporation, one of the world's largest maritime freight companies, found several of its subsidiary companies placed on American procurement blacklists. This meant these entities couldn't do business with U.S. government agencies and faced suspicion from private American companies worried about regulatory compliance. Chinese manufactured maritime equipment faced especially intense scrutiny. Cranes, loading equipment, and other machinery made in China had to provide extensive compliance documentation, proving they met American standards and didn't pose security risks. The inspection procedures for this equipment became notably more rigorous, adding time and expense to transactions that had previously been routine. After Trump returned to the presidency in January 2025, many observers hoped for a period of trade policy stability. Those hopes were quickly dashed. In February 2025, the administration announced it was not only continuing the Section 301 investigation, but actively expanding its scope and severity. The tariff rates themselves became almost punitive. Additional charges ranging from 10% to an eye-watering 125% were slapped onto Chinese goods. These weren't surgical tariffs targeting specific products deemed to benefit from unfair subsidies. They were broad-spectrum economic warfare. But the truly innovative, and from China's perspective, provocative, element was the introduction of a special port entry fee. This wasn't a tariff on goods, but rather a charge simply for vessels with Chinese connections to enter American ports. The fee was calibrated based on factors like where the ship was built and who owned it. The impact on Chinese shipbuilding was swift and severe. American companies, facing these new financial penalties, essentially stopped placing orders at Chinese shipyards. Before the policy change, companies from Japan, South Korea, and Europe accounted for roughly 15% of orders placed with Chinese shipbuilders. Within months of the new regulations taking effect, that figure plummeted to less than 5%. High-value, high-profit orders that Chinese yards had counted on were suddenly flowing to shipbuilders in other countries, particularly in South Korea and Japan. The restrictions extended beyond just tariffs and fees. Chinese shipyards found themselves cut off from crucial American suppliers. Several major yards were prohibited from purchasing certain types of U.S.-made equipment and materials, components that in some cases had no readily available alternatives. Ship construction projects that had been planned with American engines, navigation systems, or specialized steel suddenly had to be redesigned or wait for substitute parts to be sourced from other nations. The result was delays ranging from 3 to 6 months on projects that were already contracted, creating a cascade of missed delivery dates and contractual complications. Faced with these mounting obstacles, Chinese shipping companies didn't simply absorb the costs and continue business as usual. Instead, they began making strategic decisions to minimize their exposure to American ports and the fees associated with calling there. What emerged was essentially a coordinated effort, though not centrally directed, to avoid U.S. ports whenever commercially feasible. Ships that might have made Los Angeles, Long Beach, or Oakland their first stop after crossing the Pacific began choosing Canadian or Mexican ports instead, with cargo destined for American consumers being trucked across land borders. Routes were reconfigured to minimize time in U.S. waters. The data tells the story clearly. In May 2025, U.S. imports from China measured 637,000 TEUs. That's 20-foot equivalent units, the standard measurement for container cargo. This represented a staggering drop of 20.8% compared to just the previous month of April. To put that in perspective, it was the sharpest single-month decline in U.S.-China trade volumes since March 2020, when the COVID-19 pandemic first disrupted global supply chains. The impact wasn't evenly distributed across America's ports. The nation's 10 busiest container ports all reported noticeable decreases in overall import volumes. Some ports that had built infrastructure specifically to handle the China trade found themselves with underutilized capacity and reduced revenue. But China wasn't content with defensive maneuvers alone. The October 14th port fee policy represented Beijing's decision to actively retaliate rather than simply adjust to American restrictions. China's new special port fee was clearly designed as a mirror image of America's Section 301 measures, but with some distinctive Chinese characteristics in its implementation. The fee structure we mentioned earlier, starting at $56 per ton and rising to $157 per ton over 3 years, was just the beginning. The real cleverness lay in how the policy defined which vessels would be subject to the charge and which might escape it. The criteria for being charged were expansive, casting a wide net to capture essentially any vessel with meaningful American connections. But crucially, the policy also included exemption provisions, and these exemptions revealed Beijing's strategic thinking. Ships built in China were exempt, regardless of who currently owned or operated them. This created an immediate incentive for shipping companies to order vessels from Chinese yards. Similarly, foreign-owned vessels entering Chinese shipyards for maintenance while not carrying cargo were exempted, encouraging the use of Chinese ship repair facilities. These exemptions served dual purposes. On the surface, they appear to be reasonable carve-outs that prevent the policy from being excessively punitive, but they also function as incentives designed to steer global shipping business toward Chinese maritime industries. If you're a shipping company executive making decisions about where to build your next vessel or where to schedule your ship's next major overhaul, these exemptions could easily tip the scales toward choosing Chinese providers. The policy also included a broader escape clause, Article 6, which allowed for case-by-case exemptions when ships served primarily Chinese interests, even if they technically met some of the criteria for being charged. This provision would soon prove crucial, as we'll see. When the policy took effect on October 14th, ships already in transit or approaching Chinese ports suddenly faced some really tough decisions. The first victim, or I guess more accurately, the first example, was a container ship called the Manuka, operated by the Matson Shipping Company out of the United States. The Manuka had been following its regular route and was scheduled to arrive at Ningbo Port on October 13th. Just 1 day before the new policy was set to kick in. The ship arrived as planned and began the complex process of unloading its containers. But before that unloading was even complete, port authorities delivered an invoice that basically represented the new reality of U.S.-China maritime relations. Based on the Manuka's gross tonnage and the newly applicable rate, the bill came to approximately $630,000 for that single port call. Industry analysts quickly calculated that this fee alone represented roughly half of what the ship would typically earn from chartering that voyage. In other words, the profitability of calling at Chinese ports had just been cut in half, and that's before you even consider the cost of fuel, crew, maintenance, and all the other expenses of operating a commercial vessel. The Manuka's experience sent shockwaves through the maritime industry. Shipping companies and ship operators worldwide suddenly had to recalculate the economics of routes involving Chinese ports. But honestly, the most dramatic response came from the passenger cruise industry, bringing us back to the Riviera, the ship we met at the beginning of this story. The Riviera's last-minute course change to avoid Shanghai wasn't just about the $1.6 million fee for that single port call, though that number alone was, well, pretty eye-watering. It was about the cumulative impact on the company's business model. Oceania Cruises, the company operating the Riviera, had planned for the ship to call at Shanghai 5 times during the year as part of its Asia-Pacific itineraries. If they went ahead with those plans and paid the special port fee each time, the total would reach $8.2 million. To really understand how devastating this would be, just consider that industry analysts estimated this sum represented roughly 8 times the net profit the company typically earned from operating an entire cruise route. In other words, the port fees alone would turn what should be a profitable operation into a guaranteed money-losing venture. The decision to divert to Busan, South Korea may have made economic sense from the cruise line's perspective, but it created a public relations nightmare. Passengers had paid significant sums for cruises specifically marketed as including Shanghai. Many had chosen this itinerary precisely because they wanted to experience that particular city. Shore excursions had been booked and personal plans had been made. The sudden substitution of Busan, while itself an interesting city, just wasn't what passengers had signed up for. Complaints flooded social media and travel review sites. Some passengers even demanded partial refunds, arguing that a key element of what they'd purchased had been removed. The cruise line found itself caught between impossible choices: pay fees that would destroy the profitability of the route, or anger customers by changing itineraries without adequate notice. Other cruise companies faced similar calculations. Some chose to pay the fees and absorb the costs, basically treating it as a marketing expense necessary to deliver the promised experience. Others followed the Riviera's lead and adjusted their itineraries, accepting the customer service consequences as preferable to the financial hit. If cruise ships had flexibility in their itineraries, container ships faced even more complex logistical puzzles. These vessels operate on precisely calculated schedules, with cargo carefully planned to be loaded and unloaded at specific ports in a specific sequence. Changing a container ship's route isn't as simple as just steering to a different harbor. It potentially requires reorganizing cargo for hundreds of different customers. Nevertheless, as soon as word spread about China's new policy, container ship operators began making exactly these tough adjustments. On October 10th, even before the policy officially took effect, 2 U.S.-flagged container vessels operated by Matson were scheduled to call at Ningbo Port. Upon learning what was coming, the company made the decision to bypass Ningbo entirely. Instead, these ships diverted to Busan, South Korea, where the cargo destined for China was unloaded and then transported overland or via smaller feeder vessels. Similarly, a vessel called the Pusan Express, operated by the German shipping giant Hapag-Lloyd but registered under the U.S. flag, canceled its planned stop at Ningbo and also diverted to Busan. These diversions come at significant cost. Container shipping is an industry where margins are often measured in single-digit percentages, and efficiency really is everything. Every additional nautical mile traveled burns fuel and takes time. Every transshipment, unloading cargo at one port only to reload it onto another vessel or truck, adds handling costs and introduces opportunities for damage or delay. Moreover, these logistical complications create uncertainty throughout the supply chain. An American retailer expecting a shipment of Chinese-manufactured goods on a specific date suddenly finds that shipment delayed by days or even weeks as it takes a more circuitous route. This can mean empty shelves, missed sales opportunities, and frustrated customers. So, who bears these costs? In theory, they could be passed on to the Chinese exporters in the form of reduced payments, or to American importers in the form of increased prices. In practice, the shipping companies themselves often end up absorbing much of the expense, at least at first, because their contracts were signed based on the expectation of direct routes. Over time, these costs get factored into future pricing, meaning American consumers ultimately pay through higher prices for goods. Amid all these diversions and complications, one vessel stood out for a different reason. On October 16th, the Spectrum of the Seas, a massive modern cruise ship operated by Royal Caribbean, sailed into Shanghai and docked without incident. More surprisingly, it didn't pay a single cent of the special port fee. So, how did Royal Caribbean manage this seemingly impossible feat? The answer lies in the careful application of the exemption provisions in China's policy, particularly the discretionary language in Article 6.